We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 32a. This daf is sponsored by David and Ariella Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amud or a Daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amud, Rabbi Chelbo said that I saw Rav Huna, that with regards to mezuzah, he made the parshios stumos, he made them closed. What that means is that when the first parsha ends, there's a little space, and then the second parsha starts on the same line. According to most Rishonim, that's the understanding of stumos as opposed to psuchos. An open parsha would mean that the second parsha starts on the next line. And on the previous Amud, the Gemara asked a question on this from a Braisa, and the Braisa of Shimon ben Elazar says that Rabbi Meir would write a mezuzah on duchsustus. Duchsustus is when they would split the hide, so the outer part of that split hide, that is the klaf, that's the parchment for a Sefer Torah, and the inner part is called duchsustus, and that's what the mezuzah would be written on. It was also written kimindaf, which means that the columns were long and narrow, and the Braisa continues, va'osa revach milmala v'revach milmata, there would also be a margin at the top and a margin at the bottom of the mezuzah scroll. V'osa parshiosa pesuchos, and the parshios of the mezuzah would be psuchos, they would be open. That is against what Rabbi Chelbo said from Rav Huna. Amarti lo, I said to him, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Matam, Rabbi, what's the reason for this? Amar li, he said to me, Hoel ve'in smuchos min haTorah, since these two parshios that are in the mezuzah are not next to one another in the Torah, that's why the parshios are psuchos, that's why they are open. And the Gemara continues and says, V'yamar Rav Chananel amar Rav, and Rav Chananel said that Rav said, Halacha, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, the halacha is like this Braisa, like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and so that seems to imply that the parshios of mezuzah are actually psuchos and not stumos. That goes against Rav Huna on the previous Amud. As the Gemara says, my lav psuchos, isn't this statement that the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Elazar, isn't it going on psuchos? And so again, that would contradict the previous Amud brought from Rav Huna. And the Gemara says, lo, no, arevach, we're actually going on the margins. Again, one of the other things the Braisa said is that in a mezuzah there are margins at the top and the bottom, and that's what Rav meant when he said halacha Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, but the halacha does not necessarily follow Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar in terms of open parshios. And Rashi explains, Amarti lo Revi Matam, I said to him, Rebbe, what's the reason? Ata osa osam psuchos, why are you making the parshios, why are you making them open? V'halo b'Torah stumos ein, but in the Torah, it's actually stumos, these are closed parshios. And Rashi continues, oso revach shela'achar uvisharecha, that space that's after uvisharecha, that's the first parsha of Shema, that's in the mezuzah, who saw some, that is a closed parsha. V'harevach be'emsa hashita, there's a space in the middle of the line, and again, when it's stumos, what that means is that the next parsha begins on that same line after that space. Amar li, so he said to me, the reason why in the mezuzah itself it's psuchos, even though in the Torah it's stumos, hoalu v'Torah ein an smuchos, because these two parshios, meaning the parsha of Shema v'Yahavta and the parsha of V'hoyem Shemoah, are not next to one another in the Torah. Hanoch shtei parshios shezuk suva b'Veschanon, this one is written in parshas Veschanon, v'zuk suva b'V'hoya Ekev, and the other one is in parshas Ekev. Lefikach anu osim psuchos, that's why we make them psuchos. And Rashi continues, my lav psuchos, again, when Rav says the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Elazar, isn't that going on psuchos, kama Rav? That's what Rav meant, said the halacha Rabbi Shimon, that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon. And again, the Gemara said, no, perhaps Rav is just going on revach, on the idea of the margins in the mezuzah. And the Gemara continues, v'kama revach, now how large is the margin in a mezuzah, at the top and at the bottom? Amar Rav Menashe bar Yaakov, Rav Menashe bar Yaakov says, v'yamri lo Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yaakov, and some say, Rav Shmuel bar Yaakov says, kimelo atva de safri, it's like the clips that are used by the scribes. They would use clips to hold down the parchment when they were writing the mezuzah. Rashi explains, atva de sifri or de safri, eitz sadok hanoshek dape kuntris shelo yichvalu. The idea is they would use these clips, the scribes would use these clips in order to hold down the parchment of the mezuzah, so that way it wouldn't roll up, they'd be able to write on the parchment. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Abai le Rav Yosef, Abai said to Rav Yosef, V'atlo tizbara, the chiyama Rav Revach, do you not think that when Rav said the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Elazar, that he was going on the margins? It has to be he was going on that and not going on the concept of psuchos, because we know V'harav islay minhaga, because we know that Rav, in general, he follows minhag, he follows custom. V'ha'idna no galma b'stumos, and we also know that nowadays the custom is stumos when it comes to mezuzah, and so therefore clearly Rav Rav was not saying the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar with regards to psuchos, because again he would say by mezuzah stumos, because that is the minhag. And where do we see that Rav follows minhag? The Amar Rabba Amar Rav Kahana Amar Rav, because Rabba said that Rav Kahana said that Rav said, Im Yavo Elio, if Elio Navi would come, V'yomar, and say cholzin b'minol, that we do chalitza with a shoe, shomin lo, we would listen to him. Ein cholzin b'sandal, but if he would say we do not do chalitza with a sandal, ein shomin lo, then we wouldn't listen to him. Shekvar noagu ha'am b'sandal, because the minhag already is to do it with a sandal, and so you see he's following minhag. For Rav Yosef Amar Rav Kahana Amar Rav, Rav Yosef said that Rav Kahana said that Rav said a slightly different version of this statement. Im yavo Elio v'yomar ein cholzin b'minol, if Elio would come and say not to do the chalitza with a minol, shomin lo, we would listen to him. Ein cholzin b'sandal, not to do chalitza with a sandal. This part is the same as the statement above, as the version above. Ein shomin lo, we would not listen to him. Shekvar noagu ha'am b'sandal, because again the minhag of the people is to do it with a sandal. And so in any case, the main point over here is that Rav is saying kvar nohagu ha'am, since that's already the minhag, so therefore ein shomin lo, therefore we don't listen to him, and therefore you see that Rav follows minhag. The Gemara continues and notes, v'amrinan mai beinaya, we say, what's the difference between the two versions? Again, in the first version, the idea was that if Elio would come and say cholzin b'minol shomin lo, and then in the second version, if he said ein cholzin b'minol shomin lo, what's the difference? The difference is minol lechatchila ika beinaya. The difference is, should a shoe, is it able to be used lechatchila? That's the difference. We'll see Rashi in a moment. But in any case, the entire point of the Gemara over here is that Rav follows minhag, and the minhag by mezuzah is stumos, and so therefore elolav shma mino arevach. Rather, do we not see from here that when Rav says the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Elazar, it's going on the margins, that part of the brisa, and the Gemara says shma mino. Indeed, we see that this is the case. And before seeing Rashi, we will note that the difference between a minol, a shoe, and a sandal in the Gemara is not the same as in the terminology nowadays. The difference in the Gemara, according to most commentaries, is that a minol is made of soft leather at the top, and a sandal is made of hard leather at the top. And Rashi explains minol lechatchila, again, that's the difference between the two versions. It means as follows. Leman Damar, according to the version that said, Im yavo Elio v'yomar cholzin b'minol shomin lo, that if Elio and Navi would come and say that we should do chalitza with a minol, we would listen to him. So kasavar minol hashta lechatchila lo, that version is saying that nowadays lechatchila one should not use a minol, ad sheyavo Elio v'yor, until Elio and Navi comes and says that's what we should do. Leman Damar, and according to the version, Im yavo Elio v'yomar ein cholzin b'minol shomin lo, that if Elio and Navi would come and say not to do chalitza with a minol, we would listen to him. That's mechlal, that implies ad sheyavo Elio v'yomar lo techolzu b'minol cholzin, that again, before Elio and Navi comes, that version implies that we would lechatchila do the chalitza with a minol. And the Gemara continues with a second answer to the question from the brisa against Rav Huna. Again, Rav Huna said that with regards to mezuzah, it is stumos, the parshios are closed, and the brisa said psuchos, that the parshios are open. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Gomer, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, he answers the question as follows: mitzvah la'asosan stumos, that really when it comes to mezuzah, the mitzvah lechatchila is to make the parshios stumos, and that is again what Rav Huna did. V'yavdinu psuchos, but if it's psuchos, if that's how it's done, shapir dami, that is fine, meaning after the fact, that is fine. Umay psuchos to come Rav Shimon ben Elazar, and in the brisa, when Rav Shimon ben Elazar said psuchos by mezuzah, what did he mean? He meant af psuchos. He simply meant even if it's done psuchos, that is still okay, and therefore that would resolve the question against Rav Huna. And the Gemara continues, Lema Messiah, let us bring a support for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's answer from the following brisa. The brisa is discussing the general idea of ein moridin miktusha chamura lektusha kala. We don't go down from a higher level of holiness to a lower level of holiness. And the brisa continues and says, Kayotze bo, similarly, Sefer Torah Shabbalah, Sefer Torah which is worn, U'tfilin Shabbalah, or tefillin which are worn, meaning to say they're worn out, Ein osin mehen mezuzah, one cannot use the Sefer Torah, the tefillin, to then make a mezuzah. Lefisha ein moridin miktusha chamura lektusha kala, because we don't go down from the stricter level of holiness, the higher level of holiness, to the lesser level of holiness, and therefore the mezuzah is considered to be a lesser level of holiness than the Sefer Torah Torah and tefillin, so we can't use an old Sefer Torah or old tefillin to create mezuzah. But the Gemara says hamoridin. But let's say that wasn't true. Let's say we were allowed to go from kedusha chamura to kedusha kala. Apparently, technically speaking, we could use Sefer Torah and tefillin to make mezuzah. Osin, apparently we could make mezuzah out of Sefer Torah and tefillin. But there's a problem. Amai, why should that be true? Hacha stumos, here by Sefer Torah, the parsha which is in mezuzah is stuma, as we said above. V'hacha psuchos, and over here by the mezuzah it's psuchos, it's open according to the brisa, and so therefore we have to say Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak is right, that the brisa which says psuchos by mezuzah, that just means that is also okay, but really stumos is the way that it's made by mezuzah, and therefore we could use from a Sefer Torah to the mezuzah. But the Gemara continues and answers, not necessarily. Dilma, maybe this brisa which says that in theory a Sefer Torah can be used to make a mezuzah, a worn out Sefer Torah can be used for mezuzah, maybe that's just lahashlim, that's just to complete certain parts of the mezuzah. It doesn't literally mean the entire parsha is lifted as is from the Sefer Torah. And Rashi explains tefillin, with regards to tefillin, kedushasan chamura mi mezuzah. The holiness of tefillin is greater than mezuzah. Why? Sheyesh b'hen daled parshios, because there are 4 parshios in tefillin, there are just 2 parshios in mezuzah. Hacha stumos, here stumos, meaning b'sefer Torah. By Sefer Torah, as we said, that parsha of Shema v'Yohavta is stumos, v'hacha psuchos b'mezuzah, and here by mezuzah, it is psuchos, as we said, between the 2 parshios. That's what we said in the brisa. Elo shema mina b'mezuzah nami, stumos ein. Rather, no, you see from this brisa, that really by mezuzah it is stumos, again, in accordance with what Rav Huna said, the brisa that says psuchos, it just means that psuchos is also okay. That's why this brisa is a support for the approach of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. But then the Gemara said, not necessarily, v'dilma lahashla, maybe the brisa here just means to complete certain parts, certain elements of mezuzah. Dilma hadadai kinon hamoridin osin shem chasra mitfilin mezuzah. Again, let's say you had a little bit that was missing, so then you'd be able to be mashlim, you'd be able to complete it with the Sefer Torah, tefillin, etc. And the Shita Mekubetzes has an expanded girsa over here as follows: Osin lo lasos mezuzah kula mi Sefer Torah. We don't mean in this brisa that the entire mezuzah is going to be made from a Sefer Torah. Deliolam psuchos beinam, because maybe really we do need psuchos by a mezuzah. Avolim chasra mezuzah shita achas, but let's say the mezuzah is missing one line. Ilav dein moridin, if not for the fact that we're not allowed to go down in kedusha. Hayonotlin shita achas mi Sefer Torah. We could take one line from a Sefer Torah, v'tifra b'mezuzah, and then sew it into a mezuzah, umashlimin, and complete it in that way. But the Gemara continues and asks, Hamorid and Osin, but still, if we were allowed to go down in Kedusha, can we really make from tefillin a mezuzah? V'hatanya, but we learned in a brisa, halacha l'Moshe misinai, there's a halacha l'Moshe misinai that tefillin al haklaf, that tefillin is written on the klaf. Again, when the hide of the animal is split, the klaf is the outer part of that hide, and the duchsustus is the inner part. So the tefillin is written on klaf, umezuzah al duchsustus, and mezuzah is written al duchsustus. So that's one difference between the two. And klaf b'makom basar duchsustus b'makom sar. The brisa notes that klaf, when you split that hide in half, so it's the inner part, that's called makom basar, the place that's facing the flesh of the animal. That's the area of the klaf that's used for tefillin. And then the duchsustus, which is the inner part of that split, that is the way it's facing outwards towards the sar, towards the hair. It's the outer part that you write the mezuzah on. That's the opinion of most commentaries in terms of understanding what it means klaf and what it means duchsustus. But in any case, you see from this brisa that tefillin should not be able to be used for mezuzah because they're written on different parts of the hide. And the Gemara answers to that, lemitzvah, that's just a mitzvah lechatchila. It doesn't have to be that this one is on klaf and this one is on duchsustus. And Rashi explains, klaf kosvin ola b'makom basar alma tefillin. So we see that tefillin, iyafshar lasos mezuzah. It should be impossible to make that for mezuzah. Tohal klaf nichtavu, because tefillin is written on klaf. Umeshani, the Gemara then answers, lemitzvah, that's just a mitzvah lechatchila, meaning mitzvah is tefillin ala klaf, lechatchila tefillin should be on klaf. Mezuzah aduchsustus, and mezuzah should be on duchsustus. Avolim shina, but if one would deviate and do it the other way around, ein bekach klum, that's not an issue. Hilkachim moridanos, and that's why the brisa says that if we were able to go down in kedusha, one could use tefillin for mezuzah. But the Gemara continues, Vatanya, but didn't we learn in a brisa the exact opposite? Shina pasal, that if one deviates in this regard, it is disqualified. And so therefore, it's not true that it's just lichatchila that the tefillin is on klaf and the mezuzah is on duchsustus. It says in the brisa, it's completely disqualified if one deviates. And the Gemara says to that, well, that's bitfillin. That might just be by tefillin. Meaning to say, Could be that by tefillin it's written on klaf, it cannot be written on duchsustus at all. But mezuzah, one is able to deviate, so then in theory one can use old tefillin for mezuzah, because maybe by mezuzah deviation is fine. But the Gemara still asks, Vatanya, but we learned in a different brisa, Shina bein bozeh uvein bozeh pasal, deviation both in this case and in that case, which presumably means both by tefillin and mezuzah is disqualified. So that's not a good answer. And the Gemara continues, no, idi v'idi betefillin. When it says bein bozeh uvein bozeh, it actually is always talking about tefillin. It's not talking about mezuzah at all, and it just means as follows: V'hadeh chazvinu aklaf b'makom sar. Let's say one writes it on klaf, but again, as we said above, with regards to klaf, it's supposed to be b'makom basar, on the inner part of the klaf. So if one writes it on the outer part, on the makom sar, the part that's facing the hair, then that would be pasul v'ha. And then when it says pasul again in another situation, that's also talking about tefillin, as we'll see in a moment, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis.